Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Project State and Its Rivals, A New History of the 20th and 21st Centuries, by Charles S. Maier, narrated by Stephen Caffrey. Preface. This work arose as an effort to make sense of the political and economic transformations of our time. This can be a treacherous ambition. The historian's present is always changing, and at times drastically. I was born a half-year before World War II began in Europe. As a young but politically aware observer, I lived through episodes of the Cold War. Then, 40 years later, witnessed what seemed to be its sudden and surprising conclusion. Leave aside the digital revolution or the changes in medical science that have transformed all our lives, my adult lifetime has seen the vigorous post-war recovery of Germany and Japan, the peak of U.S. economic and international primacy, and the legal, if not socio-economic, dismantling of its racial hierarchies. In recent decades, the stupendous rise of Chinese national power, and even as I send this manuscript to press, in my 80s, the Russian effort to reconstitute the imperial hold it formerly exercised in Eastern Europe. This book, however, focuses on the developments that do not always spring to mind as constitutive of our times. I believe nation and territory and cultural specificities provide important coordinates for structuring historical narrative. But this book does not emphasize these markers. It is not a general survey of world history, nor a history of the nation-state and its conflicts, nor a story of celebrated and infamous leaders, important though they have been. It bypasses the military history of the great wars, the genocides, and the development of regimes that brought early death to perhaps 200 million people of the 11 billion or so who lived during a part or all of the 20th century. Instead, I have tried to illuminate other conflicts and forces that have successfully shaped, or perhaps more precisely, allowed the evolving political outcomes of the 20th century and the first quarter of the 21st. To this end, I propose collective protagonists that are different from the heroes and villains many histories follow. I focus first on project states, both democratic and totalitarian, with ambitious agendas for transforming political institutions, civil society, and even mentalities. Second, I examine resource empires, lingering formally until the 1960s, and thereafter bequeathing international legacies of racial and economic inequality that still remain powerful. Third and fourth, the book discusses the transnational domains of capital and of the organizations supposedly devoted to disinterested governance. My account of the last 100-some years thus seeks to follow the evolution and changing weight of these four collective agents, sometimes working against each other, sometimes in tandem. This does not mean our old historical categories, such as democracies and dictatorships, are invalid or obsolete. This is hardly the case. But reframing long-term categories of historical analysis can provide a more comprehensive sense of the changes underway for a century or more. I have felt challenged, I must confess, by Montesquieu, who argued in the mid-18th century that the laws, by which he also meant institutions, had to be consistent with each other, that when one changed, all must change, and that their underlying relationship was what he called the spirit of the laws. I have tried to account for our new spirit of the laws. Are there lessons to be learned from this history? Can it be applied or provide us guidance for the present? My view of a historical work is that besides conveying information about the past, it should most importantly enlarge the world of the listener, somewhat as listening to a fine musical performance enhances the listener. It should provide an awareness of connectedness and difference, analogy, complexity, regularity, and contingency. Perhaps it makes listeners better able to confront the policy decisions they must face. Perhaps it instructively illuminates past short-sightedness, but it cannot predict which alternatives will yield success. As John Stuart Mill recognized in A System of Logic, it takes only one altered variable among many to make the present differ fundamentally from the past. Still, I do think there is a lesson that this perspective on the past can provide. It is that an active project state, an innovative economy, and disinterested governance need to remain in some balance. Without alternate sources of political agency, the project state alone can become abusive. Excessive rewards to capital will corrupt, and the prescriptions of rational governance alone remain feeble and often unaware of self-interest that may have motivated their prescriptions. The remnants of empire and the decay of republics suggest, I believe, that societies cannot sustain good government if inequality exceeds certain boundaries. But that belief is admittedly a political one, and what those boundaries are is difficult to say. I tend to believe that institutions of governance play a generally beneficial role and deserve the authority they claim, particularly in view of the climate change that challenges us all. Nonetheless, as my last chapter suggests, these claims of governance and expertise can produce their own backlash, and accommodating them in a democracy is a difficult task. In any case, if a listener wants guidance from the past outlined in this book, as well as an interpretation, these rather commonplace suggestions would be my offering. This work does not aspire to be an encompassing narrative of global developments since 1900 or even 1914. My own long-term research has centered on Western Europe and to a degree the United States, and I have focused on these areas at the expense, most likely, of doing justice to significant currents of thought and political aspirations that emanate from Latin America, Asia, and Africa. Moreover, while this book draws on my own historical reading and teaching for more than half a century, it does not claim to rest on direct immersion in the archives that exist for the countries and institutions discussed, even when I have the language capacity. It does cite primary sources at points where I have undertaken previous research, findings that went into specialized articles and essays, but it rests more on the monographic investigations of other scholars. To turn around the old statement about standing on the shoulders of giants, I for one see further, because I stand on the shoulders of my graduate students, past and present, and other young researchers. In my citations, I have tried to privilege recent scholarship, which often productively revises and amplifies older classic accounts. Of course, I have read and can cite only a selection of all the works that have been produced on the developments under study. By and large, I do not cite general historical works that have provided narrative backgrounds, even though some are very valuable.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?